Hello, welcome to D&D History Hub. Today we are in Sydney, Australia. It is 8 AM on January the 20th, 1880. The place is Darlinghurst Jail. Two men are about to die, executed by hanging. They are Andrew George Scott, aged 37, a former Church of England stipendiary lay reader who was born in County Down, Ireland, and Thomas Rogan, a local lad, aged 23. They have been found guilty of murder and sentenced to death at the Central Criminal Court in Sydney on December the 11th, 1879, for offences, including murder, committed while holding up a sheep station near Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. We have an eyewitness account of the execution written by F Archibald, the 26-year-old co-editor and founder of a new newspaper called the Sydney Bulletin. Under Archibald's editorship, it will go on to be one of Australia's most influential and successful newspapers, helping to develop a spirit of Australian nationalism, including promoting local artists, writers and poets, some of whom, such as Badger Patterson and Henry Lawson, remain well known today. Archibald's name is also well known today in Australia, as he left money in his will to fund a major art award. It's called the annual Archibald Prize for Portraiture, and it's very popular amongst the arty people. Archibald was an Australian nationalist back in the 19th century. He believed Australia should be an independent country, free of the British. He denounced hanging as a barbaric British practice that should be abolished. British laws, he said, were savage and revengeful. This article that he's writing today, therefore, it's not just there for its grisly shock value and to boost readership. He wants to use it as a means to bring about a change in the law. So, the story begins on page 1 and continues inside the newspaper across pages 4, 5 and 6. There's a couple of thousand words more. It includes chilling illustrations drawn by William MacLeod, a London-born artist and businessman and a long-term acquaintance of Archibald. The thumbnail to this video depicts a couple of the drawings that he made. To place this article in its mundane, everyday context, when the story comes to an end on page 6, directly beneath it is another headline that says, "Sporting notes, recording that Adelong has beaten Gundagai at cricket." Also, this article is not preceded by any kind of warning about disturbing content. It's just assumed that, everybody's tough enough to deal with it. This is life, this is death. So the execution story actually begins with an interview with the chief hangman. It's a bloke called Robert Howard, otherwise known as Nosey Bob, who was born in Norwich in England in 1832 and migrated to Australia in 1861. He's called Nosey Bob precisely because he doesn't have a nose. For many years, he'd been a successful cab driver in Sydney, horse and cart cab driver. However, one of his horses kicked him in the face, smashing his nose and disfiguring him for the rest of his life. So subsequently unemployed, Nosey Bob accepted the unwanted post of New South Wales' first salaried hangman. It's £170 a year, which wasn't bad in those days. In all, he carried out 66 executions at Darlinghurst Jail, and he even acted as a sort of guest hangman at other states and in New Zealand. So the article gets underway with Archibald in the interview asking Bob if people think his position as executioner is strange. "It may be queer to outsiders, but here I am," he replies. "I've got a good cottage and £12 10 shillings a month," he says, adding, "I've got as good a garden as there is anyway. I've got the biggest cabbages and the finest flowers." I think sounding more like a hobbit than a hangman, but there you go. Moving on to the execution, Archibald records that at precisely 5 minutes to 9 that morning, the convicts were handed over to the hangman by the governor of the jail. Scott's face paled at the sight of the executioner, and his arms were at once tied with whipcord at the elbows in an unusually tight way. Rogan quietly submitted to the process of pinioning and was led by the assistant hangman to the drop. When he came out to die, Scott's heart seemed to fail him, writes Archibald. He endeavoured to look unconcerned, tried to smile, but his upper lip quivered like that of a dog at bay. Rogan simply looked dazed. Archibald continues, "The executioner took from his pocket the white cap and rapidly drew it over the head of Scott, who at that instant turned to Rogan and said, 'Goodbye, Tom.' The cap was then drawn over Rogan's head and the rope placed around his neck. Then the executioners stole softly from their victims' sides. The assistant hangman threw his whole weight against the lever, and in a second, Andrew George Scott and Thomas Rogan, with their necks broken, were hanging in midair. Scott died instantly. Rogan's frame quivered several minutes after he fell. The scene at the scaffold was terrible, writes Archibald. Death by the hand of the executioner, the worst of all spectacles, sickening and awe-inspiring. The convict's wasted frame, his sunken eyes, his white face, the helpless, doubled-up appearance given him by the pinioning of his arms as he stood beneath the beam. For a second, he regarded with a kind of dreamy yet keen curiosity first the dangling cord which was soon to bind him to the grave, and next the perfidious trapdoor on which he stood, enough to strike terror into the heart of even the man who could shake hands with death in any other form. Then to the execution itself. First comes the rattle of the trap, then almost instantaneously the dull, fatal sound caused by the rope straining on the beam. It is a sound from which there is no echo, and which is invariably followed by a silence as profound as in itself to suggest death. The convict's arms are tied and can grasp at nothing. His feet suddenly lose their support. He must feel as if it were all a horrid dream, years being crowded into seconds. The man who drops from the scaffold feels himself falling, not 6 or 7, but 10,000 feet. At last his fall is broken. He comes to the end of the rope. The hand of death is laid upon him, and he wakes in another world. Hanging, declares Archibald after witnessing this, is a barbarous practice of British law which must be consigned to the past. He says, "I have always felt that an execution was a cold-blooded brutality, as heinous in its cruelty as the crime which it expiates." They did put commas around that. More than 1,500 people were hanged in Australia between 1820 and 1900. From 1901 to 1967, Australia's states carried out a total of 114 executions. However, 81 of those occurred during the first 20 years after Federation. The last state to actually abolish capital punishment in Australia was New South Wales, and that was in 1985, but no one had been executed in the state since September 1913. And Australia's final legal execution took place in Victoria in 1967. Thank you for listening.